So, since I'm the first presenter, I'd just like to thank all of you for coming out. This really means a lot to all of us. We've been working on all of these projects and presentations for almost a year now, and it's really exciting to get to really start presenting. So, just get started with mine, I guess. So, my study that I ran was the orthographic expectations and their effects on learning L2 phonology. But before I get into that, oh, there's the microphone. I'm going to just go a little bit over my experience in Pyre, and there are two other people here from Tarragona, Ben and Akina, so they'll probably give you more of this, so I'll be brief. So we are partnered with, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, Universitat Rovira i Virgili in Tarragona, which is like northeast Spain, part of Catalonia, a little bit south of Barcelona, and our two advisors are Josep de Mestre and Pilar Ferrer, and both of them, along with the other names you see, Marc Boache, Roger Boada Navarra, and a couple others, helped us really get our presentations working. And I really do need to is there a laser on this? Oh, there is. I really do need to give a really big thanks to all of these people, just because when we arrived in Tarragona, we weren't sure. There were four of us, the three of us in Clara. We weren't sure if we were going to get enough participants. We weren't sure if we'd even have enough rooms to run participants. And so we had our first lab meeting, and everyone was saying, how many participants you want, like 10, 15? And all of us said 40. So it was a little fun trying to just recruit random people to do our studies. But with the help of all of our advisors, we really got it working. And then just 2 seconds about Tarragona. It's bilingual, it's in Catalonia. All the signs are in Catalan, it gets really frustrating. I'm not gonna go super into depth about Pyre in general, but I think these pictures summarize it. It was one of the probably best experiences of my life, 2 months of just awesomeness. This one's really important. Ham-flavored chips. You can't beat that. So I'll just move on then. Pyre's great, I love it. My project. So in general, what this project's looking at is sort of the environment that occurs in an ESL classroom, for example, in America, where we have people from all over the world, all different L1 backgrounds coming and trying to learn English together. So the difference between an ESL classroom and just learning a language in general is that you encounter the orthography and the new phonological word forms at the same time, in the sense that when you're learning English in ESL, you're given the written word and the spoken word simultaneously. And so there's this possibility for an interaction between your L1 and the way it orthographically is set up and phonologically, and the way that English is presented as a very orthographically complex and also phonologically complex L2. And studies, I'll get into that in a sec. This study, wanted to investigate the way that what we call orthographic expectations from your L1 would affect the way that you learned in L2. So we defined orthographic expectations in this sense as the way you approach a new L2 writing system based on what you learned about your first language's writing system. So a little bit more background. So the idea of orthographic transparency is kind of the basis of this study, and it essentially is the level of correspondence between a language's writing system and its phonology, in the sense that a very transparent orthography like Spanish or Turkish has a very close to one-to-one correspondence between graphemes and phonemes, whereas an orthographically opaque language like English or French or Icelandic has a lot more of a complex sort of relationship between the writing system and how that actually decodes into spoken words. So multiple studies have been done on this, and they've shown that the way your L1 orthographic system is set up can actually affect the way you learn in L2, not just the L2 writing system, but also its phonology, the way that letters and sounds interact, and even without being given written forms, some studies, which I think is part of the Escudero study, found that your L1 writing system can affect your L2 phonology without even being given L2 written word forms. And kind of one of the most important studies that I was basing my research on was this Erdner and Burnham 2005 study, which showed there's a graph on the next slide which will probably make it make more sense, but an L1 orthography that's opaque versus one that's transparent react in almost completely different ways when they're given an L2, if that L2 is opaque or transparent. So if we look at this graph, you can see, so the way their study was set up is they gave either Turkish or Spanish, or Turkish or English speakers either Spanish stimuli or Irish stimuli. So Spanish is a very transparent writing system. Irish is intensely opaque, I would say. Oh yeah, we'll get to that. The Turkish participants are in black, and the number of errors they made, as you see in Spanish, is Turkish participants, as you can see, the percentage of errors that they made in the Spanish stimuli when they weren't given a writing system, so just audio-visual, is about what we'd expect, and then it drops significantly when they're actually given a writing system. So Turkish participants, very transparent orthography, given a very transparent L2, significant facilitation in learning word forms. We go over here, they do significantly worse, or significantly worse than they did in Spanish when they're giving the writing system for Irish. Because when you're Turkish and you have a very transparent L1, and then you're given Irish, which almost makes no sense at all, it's gonna hurt pretty bad. But then our Australian English participants, you see that they do almost equally well across the study. Like the difference between the orthographic facilitation versus harm between Spanish and Irish is significantly less for the English participants. And Erdner and Burnham didn't really go into that too much, which is kind of where this study fills in the gaps. So Erdner and Burnham did their study by giving all of their participants a certain amount of time to look at stimuli and then just tested them on it. So what this study was doing was we wanted to see if we give participants as much time as they need to hit a criterion, then does that mean that they actually learn the writing system? And will they be able to actually translate that onto learning new word forms in an L2? And so this study is kind of changing what Erdner and Burnham did by looking at the time course of learning and possibly the sorts of methods that they used. So our research questions here are, do speakers form orthographic expectations based on their L1, like straight out, does an L1 orthography affect the way you learn a new one? And then second, how are these going to influence the way that they learn in L2? And does this change based on the relationship between L1 and L2 orthography? So I'm gonna speed up a bit, I guess. The design of this study, I'm gonna just get to the nice little graph. We have 2 conditions and 2 groups, so it's 2 by 2. We have opaque L1, which is English students at Penn State, currently still testing them because it's surprisingly hard to get Penn State students to come out and do your study. Transparent L1 were the bilingual Spanish and Catalan in Tarragona. They tended to be bilingual because they lived in Catalunya, but both languages have pretty transparent orthographies, so they're about comparable to monolingual English speakers, we would think. And then the 2 conditions are your L2 that you're learning is either transparent or it's opaque. So it's like that. If we go to the actual way that the experiment would work, get to the nice flow chart. So there are 3 main steps in the procedure. First is a learning phase, which takes technically an indefinite amount of time. The participant sees 40 novel words, and all of this is an artificial language, which I will describe on the next slide. 40 novel words that they have to go through and sort of learn how to pronounce them. So they can either just memorize the words, or they can look for patterns. They do whatever they need to until they can hit this 80% accuracy criterion in the test phase. And they can repeat learning, as you can see, until they feel like they're ready. And then once they fail the test phase, they go back. And then once they pass it, they move on to generalization, in which they're given 5 of the old words, but then 20 completely new words in the same system that they then have to figure out the pronunciation of, essentially. So it's kind of like a puzzle. It's like you're given these 40 novel words in the beginning that you learn the pronunciations of. You then have to apply whatever it is you learned to try and pronounce 20 new words. So the crux of this essentially is the artificial language. This is not a fake language, actually. This is real Irish. My language is a lot easier than that. So there are 2 conditions, both of which are based on Irish Gaelic. The transparent condition, perfect one-to-one correspondence between letters and sounds. C always makes one sound, S makes one sound. All the vowels are very consistent. Opaque is based on 5 rules. So the opaque language is technically perfectly consistent, but it would only be very obvious if you were able to actually determine these 5 rules from the word forms given in the initial part, which people tended to find, I'd say on average maybe 2 or 3 of these rules and actually successfully use them in generalization. But if you were to know all 5, the rules for how vowels change and how consonants can change sounds, then you would get 100% on generalization if you were able to actually apply them successfully. And they're all based on this. And if I had more time, I would go through this, but I'll just real quick put all these up. So these are just some examples of the words that were used. In the transparent, you can see, for example, X always makes sh, C always makes ch, and every other letter is basically consistent with how English and Spanish would pronounce it. Okay, I will just go real fast then. Our predictions were that Spanish speakers would be significantly more affected by the differences in orthography, and English speakers wouldn't be as much. So if I show, I'll just show the comparison. We have all the Spanish data. So you can see this is the time course of learning. They took significantly longer in the opaque condition than the transparent to reach the criterion. But if we look towards where we have this preliminary English data, you see that English speakers overperform on some rules. They do a significantly better job of finding some of them and significantly worse on others. But also, there's a significant difference in how long it's taking English speakers so far to actually complete the opaque task. Which means that, I mean, based on our prediction, English speakers are probably just kind of less affected by the differences in orthography because an opaque L1 makes you less disposed to be affected by an opaque or transparent L2.
There may be time for one question.
We have 1 minute.
1 minute for one question. Yes.
How many participants did you have?
We had 40 in Spain, 20 in opaque and transparent, and we're going to try and get 40 in America.
Cool stuff.
We want to know more about your language. If there is time, I'll ask you about it.